And we are live. Hello out there. It's Mario from Symbolic Studies. I hope you're doing well. The last couple of weeks have been pretty interesting. And when I saw the news of the Pope's passing, I thought this would be the perfect opportunity to talk about the symbolism related to the papacy, related to the Pope, and the Hierophant card. I was planning on doing it already. And so when I saw the news, I was like, well, I think there's a lot to explore here. And so I put this together. Thank you so much for being here if you're checking it out live. And thank you for watching if you're checking it out after the fact. If you're unaware, for all things symbolic studies, please visit symbolicstudies.com. I've got a lot of slides today and a lot of things to go over. Hopefully, you guys have been well, and hopefully you guys have had a nice spring so far. I know I have. And Taurus season actually is one of my favorite times of year, symbolically, amongst other things. But I feel as though I have a special relationship with Taurus, actually. And in fact, one of the first presentations I ever gave was on bull symbolism and cow symbolism because it hit me really, really strong. This was in person. This is way before I had Symbolic Studies, and it was to a small, limited audience in the Pacific Northwest. But I just got so deep into that rabbit hole, and there were so many revelations regarding the bull and the cow that I had to get it off my chest. And this really kind of came about after I went to India, actually, and just seeing how they sort of treat the bull and the cow really did something to me. And so when I was there, I took it upon myself to read material about it. And actually, that's where we're going to start today. So let's just get to the first slide here. So this is the Group of World Religions. That's what it's called, the Group of World Religions. And this is from The Secret Teachings of All Ages. This is a classic book from Manly P. Hall. And this is actually the first plate that you're going to see in the book. So when you actually first start reading it, the first official piece of art that you're going to see is this one right here. And I was reading this in India. I completed the whole entire thing on my trip. And I just thought it was so fascinating how it began, because it begins with, of all things, bull and cow symbolism. And so this was painted to illustrate the ways in which the bull and cow have related to all of these different world religions, right? And so if you scan this piece closely, you'll see a number of bulls. You'll see Taurus in the upper left. You're going to see the Apis bull on the right. You're going to see the golden calf. You're going to see the bull that gets slayed by Mithras from the Mithraic Mysteries. And you're going to see some others, right? And so the whole entire idea behind this piece is basically saying that a lot of origin stories for different world religions actually have an intimate connection with the bull or cow. And so again, he starts his like masterpiece work by talking about this. So I took note of that, right? And if we zoom in here, we'll see that on the upper left, you'll see that cow or bull right there representing Taurus. It's at the beginning of that sort of arch, right? And so this is a huge, huge clue that the age of Taurus and the symbolism related to the bull and the cow, extremely significant. There's lots of secrets there. There's a whole deep, deep history there, right? So let's just explore, just to begin with bull and Taurus symbolism. And I would say especially how it relates to the Abrahamic religions, right? So this would be another painting, actually, from the Secret Teachings. And you'll see here God on his throne. And then you see that he's surrounded by these four animals. So this setup with these four animals, if you know the tarot, if you study the tarot or give readings or anything like that, you'll recognize these creatures because there's a correspondence with the fixed signs and these creatures, right? And so on the lower left, you have the bull, which obviously corresponds with Taurus. On the right, you have the lion, which corresponds with Leo. And then you have the eagle, which corresponds with Scorpio. And then you have the man on the upper left, and he corresponds with Aquarius. So these creatures are known as the tetramorphs. They're known as the four faces of God, the living creatures. And so God's throne is in the middle of these creatures, right? And so even just with this, there's so many cards that represent this, but generally you're going to see it on the Wheel of Fortune card. You're going to see these creatures in the corners. Often they look like angels. You're going to see it on the World or Universe card. You'll even see it on some versions of the Hierophant as well, right? And so the bull or ox is part of this sort of setup here. And this is another illustration, essentially kind of showing you the same thing. Not the throne of God necessarily, but the four living creatures. Again, the bull is amongst them. The man, the lion, the eagle, and then the bull. And then, of course, there's so many different periods with bull and cow worship as well. And so I thought it would make sense to at least highlight and show you guys, some images of the golden calf and the idolization of the golden calf as well, right? And so my understanding is, and a lot of people have this take, when you're looking at bull symbolism and you see two very different takes on the bull or the cow. In one way, it's being revered, it's being put up on a pedestal, it's literally being worshipped. And then there's going to be other things that you're going to see where the cow or bull is sacrificed and slain, right? And to me, what this really kind of mirrors or represents is the idea that during the age of Taurus, the bull was more so held up in high regard. And then after the age of Taurus, the bull was actually slaughtered, or the bull became a demonic sort of figure, a darker figure. So that's the general setup that people have said for many years, is that the animal will be worshipped during its age. And then after the age has passed, then the energy gets flipped, right? And so it's interesting to see that there are just as much things with the bull being sacrificial in nature as well, right? Or being killed, right? Just like in the Mithraic mysteries, the classic depiction of Mithras killing the bull, right? The cosmic bull. But here's Moloch or Baal, right? And so this is a whole entire thing. It's debatable whether or not people think this did or did not happen. I've heard both sides. Not really here to parse that out necessarily, but the idea of giving your firstborn child to a bull is certainly something worth exploring. It's something that I always post about during Taurus season as well. One interesting thing I want to point out with the central image there of the bull is you'll see that there's 7 compartments within its body, right? And the number 7 really comes into play in a few different ways. And so we'll be getting into that a little bit later on in the presentation. But the number 7 is certainly a very mystical number. It's been kind of viewed as like the perfect number in some ways. It really relates to this domain that we live in as well, right? 7 days of the week, 7 colors of the rainbow, et cetera, et cetera. It really goes on and on and on and on. But I'm going to kind of highlight some ways in which the number 7 relates to the northern sky via Ursa Major. And Ursa Major was once known as the thigh of a bull as well. So I'll be getting into that. Also, the whole idea in Judaism to find the red heifer, right? And so that's kind of taken off as a storyline over the last several years. But finding the perfect red heifer is definitely a thing. So to begin with, I just wanted to explore some of these basic sort of like themes and concepts and how the bull and cow relate to, some of these religions, and still to this day, very much play like a very important part in some people's culture and in history and prophecy. Even the bull or cow, right, has been viewed as being heavenly, and that literally the heavens itself has been viewed as kind of a cosmic bull, a heavenly bull. And so this is what you're seeing right here, right? This blue bull with these stars in its belly, definitely representing the firmament, definitely representing the vault of heaven, right? And to me, this is really fascinating too, because there's all of these ideas that Earth has 4 corners. Generally, Earth is viewed as a square or a cube, and the heavens or heaven, the stars above the firmament, has been viewed more so in a circular manner, more so viewed as a sphere or something along these lines, right? And so this idea, though, of 4 corners is also attached to the idea that there are 4 winds coming from the 4 different cardinal directions, right? This also parallels, though, this idea that there are 4 pillars that hold up the heavens too. And so when I think of this bull, this heavenly bull, and then I see these people underneath it, and then I see these four legs, right? It just reminds me of these four pillars. And so I think that that's kind of a beautiful symbolic thread to pull out a little bit. And then also, too, you'll see that there is a central sort of figure there who's holding the bull as well. Definitely reminds me of a central pillar or central axis sort of concept, which is going to be a major sort of theme here in this presentation. So the bull has been viewed as being cosmic, but obviously there is a very clear terrestrial relationship, symbiotic relationship, I guess you can say, with the cow or the bull. And so the cow has been viewed as the second mother of mankind, right? And so the idea is that the cow gives so much and asks so little in return. And so from the cow, we get milk. And then from there, we get ghee and yogurt and cheese and everything else, right? All these dairy products. And then also the cow or the bull or the ox, they help around the farm, right? They can help plow and all these other things. And then there's a lot of uses for dung as well. You go to India, there's a lot of things that they use dung for. And so it really does give a lot. And so not only on a physical level, but also on a spiritual level as well. And so people have definitely made the connection of the bull and its presence, and that it brings a certain kind of humility and kind of grace with it as well. And so one of the things, too, that I just want to mention is that the Taurus constellation, when people talk about Taurus today, people mostly have this idea of an aggressive bull. And I don't think that was always the case. And in fact, there's been this great sort of flip or switch over time where a lot of the signs and a lot of symbols just in general have become way more masculine. And I personally see this as a solarization of symbolism, basically. And so a lot of signs have been viewed as being very feminine, I think, in more primordial times. And a lot of animals were viewed as being way more feminine. And so I see Taurus as being one really good example of this, actually. That Taurus was once viewed as being more feminine, receptive, nurturing. The Venusian quality, right? Taurus is ruled by Venus, was certainly there more so, I would say. And then over time, it became more aggressive, masculine. And what I say is solar. So less polar, more solar. And so let's take a look at a card here. And this is the Hierophant card from the Thoth deck. And I'm going to full screen this thing here. Okay, so the Thoth deck from 1943. This is Aleister Crowley's deck. And I'm highlighting it because the Hierophant basically is the Pope, right? And so the Pope is the man of the hour right now. And that's what we'll be decoding. And you will see that literally the Pope's throne is actually a bull. And so he's sitting on a bull. And then you can see that actually his gown, it almost looks as though his gown is just almost fused with the earth. He is one with the earth. And we're talking about fixed earth symbolism, right? And so it's interesting that there's so many 5-pointed stars here as well. And the 5-pointed star has a huge epic weave with Taurus symbolism, Venusian symbolism, and also what it actually means to be a high priest as well, right? And so that's why it's so appropriate to show the Pope in this manner, or a high priest in this manner, with the white pentacle on its chest, expanding into other pentacles. But if you look, you'll see that the pentacles, essentially, the way I view it, are all emanating from the goddess here. And so this would be Isis, but I see Isis as really an expression as well of Venus, and she is holding what looks like a sword. I actually wonder, though, if this is supposed to be a subliminal nail and that it's actually relating to the nail. She's also holding a crescent moon in one of her hands. And wouldn't you know it, that crescent moon looks a lot like bull horns, right? Does it not? Or cow horns. And so there's a receptive quality to that. And then obviously lunar symbolism as it relates to the cow and the bull is really very deep. And there's a lot of things that you can really pull out from there. But with this close-up image, you can really see that the cow or bull is looking right at us too. I've always found that almost confrontational in a way. It's looking directly at us. And then because the bull mask is in the lower left corner, there's a lot of bull symbolism in the lower left corner there, right? Speaking of the feminine, a lot of people aren't aware that some of the earliest Hierophant cards actually showed a female high priest, a high priestess. And so this is an early tarot card, the Visconti Sforza deck, and that's exactly what it shows. And so this idea of a female pope, and if you want to learn more about the female pope, I really suggest Barbara Walker's book, her book on tarot symbolism. So I plug her all the time. I have a quote from her that's coming later on in the presentation. But she has definitely a feminine perspective on things. And so she really, really highlighted this idea of a female pope. And to me, this makes a lot of sense, essentially, right? The way I kind of see the Hierophant is almost as though it's almost like a mirror. So the second card of the major arcana is the high priestess. This would be in so many ways the spiritual mother. There's actually a lot of cow symbolism and Venus symbolism with that card as well. And then you have the Empress, the third card of the major arcana. And the Empress is more so the terrestrial mother. So you have the spiritual mother in the high priestess, and then you have the terrestrial mother in the Empress. And then I think you get a very similar dynamic between the Emperor and the Hierophant. So the Emperor would be almost more of the terrestrial physical father in some ways. And then I see the Hierophant as being the spiritual father, because that's really what he represents. And so I've said this before, but when you see a figure in the tarot or elsewhere and the figure is throned, I'm inclined to think that throne symbolism actually has more to do with the goddess than anything else. And so the goddess, the feminine, the queen, however you want to phrase it, that to be throned is actually more of a feminine thing because you're more receptive. It's more of a passive position. And I go on and on and on about this, but women are so magnetic that they bring things to them, right? And so things come to them, opportunities come to them. It's more so in man's nature to need to or want to go out and conquest and travel and journey and also bring home the bacon, if you will. And so the throne is more feminine as I see it personally. This also relates to the concept of the bridal chair. There's actually a lot of symbolism with all of this stuff that strongly relates to Virgo, actually. And so when we're dealing with Virgo, we're also dealing with the Virgin. And I think of like the Virgin Mary, right? And that's who you essentially kind of see in some versions of the High Priestess card. And so the Virgin Mary, Virgo, the Virgin, or Venus, you know, which also starts with a V. There's a huge weave with the V here that we'll be diving into. I see them as largely synonymous characters, right? And so symbolism really is often about seeing the similarities over the differences, not the differences over the similarities. And this is where I think a lot of people get certain things wrong, right? Because they're unwilling to see the connections, or it kind of scrambles their brain to see the connections, and they can't possibly see that a lot of gods and goddesses and symbols really have this underlying sort of root, if you will. But the female pope, here you go. That is so fascinating. You don't really see that so much these days. But Isis being on that card reminded me that I absolutely have to show that. Hey guys, it's Mario. I hope you're enjoying the presentation so far. If you aren't already aware, I have a series called Symbolic Secrets that's only available through my site or via Patreon. At the moment, I'm releasing one episode for every major arcana card, and so far I've released 13 episodes. That's about 13 hours worth of exclusive content. Links for everything can be found at symbolicstudies.com, or if you want to go straight to Patreon, you can go to patreon.com/symbolicstudies. This is also the perfect way to support the show if you like what you're hearing. And if you do like what you're hearing, I'm confident that you'll like Symbolic Secrets. And with all that said, back to the presentation. As it relates to the bull, there's a lot of sneaky symbolism as it relates to the Pope and the bull. And so, as an example, the papal bull. So this is an official document or decree issued by a pope, right? And the bull is actually a reference to the seal that's on these documents. But if you're looking at things from a symbolic sort of lens, you can't deny that there's a connection here between the fact that the Pope essentially is a correspondent with a lot of the symbolism associated with the bull, including the fact that the Hierophant card, aka the Pope card, literally is ruled by Taurus. And here, his official documents or decrees are literally called papal bulls, right? But let's take a look at the Marseille version of the card. And so this is from 1709. And you'll see that actually a lot of the modern day Hierophant cards basically retain a lot of the same symbolism. But the main thing that I want to highlight, some of the main things I want to highlight here are one, that the Pope is sitting between two pillars. This is absolutely massive and symbolically very, very potent. And so there's a number of cards that depict two pillars in the tarot. Once again, the High Priestess would be another such example. You see two pillars in the High Priestess card. She is sitting between them. And here in the Pope card, you see him sitting between two pillars. So what does this represent? Well, if you've been following my channel, you probably have a pretty good hunch, but I'll just say that he represents the central pillar. And so whenever you see two pillars, there is a third pillar in the middle. There's an implied third pillar. And so two pillars essentially creates a doorway. It creates an opening. It creates a portal. And the central pillar symbolically represents another nature with that door or opening, and it's a vertical sort of dynamic. So it's a transcendental dynamic is what I'm trying to say. And so the Pope, by sitting between two pillars, he is symbolically representing the transcendental central pillar, right? And there's a lot of symbolism with the Pope that corresponds with key symbolism. And so he's also the keeper of the keys in many ways. And so he is basically the guardian of this symbolic sort of doorway. And we'll be unpacking what this doorway actually represents. But essentially, he and his authority, his spiritual authority, right, it transcends these other two pillars. And so it actually transcends the duality of these pillars, the masculine and the feminine pillar. There's something about this first pillar or third pillar that actually is more of an original essence and is basically something that predates duality. It is something that is more so polar in nature, actually. And so this central pillar symbolically is what connects heaven and earth together. And that is actually his role. That's the role of a high priest symbolically, is they are imbuing symbolism onto the high priest that gives him this sort of bridge-like quality, that he actually is what connects all that is above with all that is below. And so that's what the central pillar actually represents. And so one of the things I'll say is that when you get into the tarot or the Kabbalah, or you start looking into Freemasonry and all these other things, a lot of people get really fixed on the two pillars and wanting to know what the two pillars represent. And of course, I encourage you, look into the two pillars, understand and know what's going on there. But one of the things that will fast track your understanding of the two pillars is researching and understanding the symbolic value of the single pillar, right? So learn about the single pillar and you will unlock all sorts of information about the two pillars, basically. And so the Pope is always wearing, his hat there, which there's generally 3 tiers to it. And he's always holding that papal cross. There's usually 3 tiers to it. So this 3-tier dynamic is something that we'll see kind of repeated throughout this presentation. And people have said that even the papal cross kind of looks like a ladder, right? And so this central pillar very much is related to ladder symbolism as well. The ladder, also, a stairway and things of that sort, things that actually connect, heaven and earth. All right. So moving forward, I was just talking about those twin pillars. And this is just a screenshot from the Pope on Easter. And look at this picture. This blew me away, to be honest with you. Just the scale of everything. The scale of everything here is absolutely epic and massive. And so you can see that literally the Pope being the figure between the two pillars, being this transcendental pillar, this transcendental axis, if you will, literally is mirrored in real life. So these pillars are absolutely enormous. But then also you see on the balcony that there are two red pillars as well. So they are keeping up with this theme here. And this is obviously very, very ancient sort of stuff. And so what I'm getting to is that the Pope really embodies the spiritual axis for the church, for the Vatican. And that's what the high priest really represents. And so we'll unpack all of this. Also, it's important to note that he is a bridge to the other side symbolically. He is sort of a mediator. And so that's what the symbol is. And that's what the symbol represents. Symbolism as a whole study, right? So I thought it was important to just mention that symbols are also bridges, because what they're intended to do is give you support for divine connection, basically. That's the whole entire thing. Everything that has symbolic value to it, it represents something else. And ultimately, what you find out is that a symbol represents something of a higher nature, of a higher order, right? Something that maybe is more etheric or spiritual, if you want to put it that way. Symbols are bridges unto themselves. That is what the whole study of symbolism kind of breaks down to. And that's what the Hierophant or the Pope also represents, that he's supposed to be a symbol for divine connection, right? To me, this really gets into a whole entire thing about the nature of how to use symbols, what it means to idolize a symbol or a figure. And also, too, just because somebody is given sort of this title or given this sort of label, what does that mean with your relationship with that person, right? How much are you going to buy into this idea that that person literally is something of a living god or demigod or something along those lines, right? And so I leave every sort of person to kind of make up those decisions for themselves and kind of roll with things how they feel comfortable and all of that. But clearly with the Vatican and the church, the Pope is a living sort of bridge. That's really what he represents. And so Pontifex Maximus, the greatest bridge builder, that's literally what his name represents, the greatest bridge builder, right? This bridge is the central axis. This bridge, if you want to do more research on it, look up the world axis or the axis mundi. That's actually what he represents. Every major religion has something along these lines, right? And so with the church, there is a living, breathing sort of axis to the divine, right? That's what they're imbuing on the Pope. If you go to Mecca, that's what the Kaaba cube represents, right? It's this axis between heaven and earth. Some people have the same opinion, of course, with Jerusalem and the Temple Mount, that this is a sort of axial point that transcends and connects all that is above with all that is below. I think it's really interesting, actually, in India, they have a series of axis points that they rotate throughout the years. And this is what they're acknowledging in their Kumbh Mela festivals, is that they've located 3 or 4 different axis points. And there's a whole sort of mythology behind it. So it's like a rotating axis. But every culture or group needs a point of focus, essentially. That's the whole entire thing. They need some point of orientation. And that's what the Pope represents as being this bridge builder. But I also think you can essentially just refer to the Pope as sort of a walking, breathing, almost pole, actually. And so here's a card from Lon Milo Duquette. And I think his deck is really fascinating. I've talked about it many times. And I always say this, but the illustrations are a bit crude. However, the symbolism is always on point. And his stuff is pretty interesting in that way. So here's his version of the Pope card or the Hierophant card. And so you have the Pope in the middle, you have the tent behind him, and then you have these 2 trees and you have these 2 women in the foreground. And so clearly the Pope is acting as the central pillar as well, right? And so this central pillar in the house of God, It separates the heavens and it separates earth, but it also connects heaven and connects earth as well. In fact, I think this is what you're seeing in the magician card. You have the magician, he has a wand, he's pointing it up to the heavens, and then he has one hand and he's pointing it down to the ground. And he's essentially declaring, I connect all that is above with all that is below, but I also separate all that is above with all that is below. There's this idea referred to as the Great Triad, and that there is a triune relationship between heaven, earth, and man. And mankind actually is the symbolic bridge between heaven and earth. And there's so many symbols that actually represent this. You can't escape this. The tree, the mountain, the standing stone, the tower, right? And so in this card, the Pope or the Hierophant here, he is that central axis. He is that central bridge. And the tent is a perfect sort of like visual metaphor for what I'm trying to explain here, which is right behind him. So this tent clearly has a tent pole, right? And so what does the tent pole do? The tent pole separates the top and lower portion of the tent, right? So you can actually have space within the tent itself. So it separates symbolically heaven and earth, but it also connects heaven and earth as well. And in fact, the tent is a microcosm of a macrocosm. And so every holy space is a micro of a macro. And so that's the whole idea behind every single lodge, behind every single temple, and everything else, is that in some ways it's supposed to represent the universe itself, right? And so in this case, this tent has a central axis as well, right? And that's what he represents, basically. And so there are groups that do rituals in tents very similar to this, and they will make use of the central pole, and they will refer to this central pole as the axis in the middle of all things, basically, what we would refer to as the world axis, right? So you can see that this idea of the tent pole, and it's hidden, by the way, right? The same way, notice that he's hiding a couple of fingers. This is one of the themes with the Hierophant card, is that he knows things. He knows things that other people want to hear. He has secrets. He's the keeper of secrets, of esoteric doctrines, right? So again, he's the keeper of the keys. And these keys are very much symbolic. In fact, I think a lot of people may say that these keys could be verbal as well, right? They could be ritualistic. They could be initiatic, right? And so keys that open up locks, basically. And so he is this central pillar. He is this central pole. So again, he is the vertical axis. That's what the Pope really represents, connecting the above and below. And if you want a really good metaphor for this, he represents the z-axis, right? And so you have the x-axis, and then you have the y-axis. This would be on the 2D plane. And then you have the transcendental axis, right? And so this basically is the central axis, the world axis that I'm referring to, the z-axis. That's what the Pope represents. And so again, all sort of religious groups and spiritual groups generally have something that operates as a z-axis for them, as a vertical axis. So you could say, actually, mankind used to be more vertically oriented, right? That they had a connection with the heavens. They had a connection with the divine. And you stay connected, by the way, by being centered. So notice that the z-axis is emanating from the middle of this cross. And you could even say that this cross represents the cardinal directions. You can say that they represent the fixed signs, right? There's a lot of different parallels there. You could even say that it just represents a cross, right? But it's in the middle of this cross that the z-axis emanates. And so mankind in more primordial days used to be more vertically inclined. And then nowadays, mankind has kind of flattened out. And so we've become very, very horizontal. We've lost our way. There's been a fall from grace, basically. And so a lot of religions and spiritual groups will have a totem that is a reminder of the vertical axis, right? It's a very important thing. And For some people, it's a tree, a world tree. It's a standing stone, something along these lines. I would say every pilgrimage location symbolically represents this Z axis, right? Because when you look at the symbolism of all these pilgrimage sites, generally there's something about it that is mythical, transcendental, something along those lines. And so this is what the Pope represents. He represents a breathing, walking vertical axis for people. So there you go. The priest as axis or a living pole. Notice too, pole and pope. I think it's kind of interesting how similar they are. Just when you're looking at the spelling of the two. And so you don't really need to kind of stretch your mind too much to see how this is played out in real life. So when the Pope makes a public appearance, everyone's eyes are on the Pope because the Z axis or the world axis, this symbolism represents also a point of orientation. And so it gives you something to revolve around. It gives you an identity in some ways. It allows you to know where you're at in this place, just like the world axis itself. And I would say just like the North Star as well, because there's a lot of symbolism with the Z axis, axis mundi, and the North Star being a pole star. It's the point of pivot in the heavens. So all of the fixed stars go around the pole star. And so if you knew where the pole star was and you're sailing the seven seas, you know where you're going, right? Whether you're going north or south or what have you. And so in some ways, the Pope operates as something of a walking world axis, something of a walking pole star, a point of orientation. And so this is the esoteric, old, primordial way of sort of decoding all this symbolism. So wherever the Pope goes, everyone has their head on a swivel. Everyone's looking in his direction, right? Because he's operating as this axis, this vertical axis in a horizontal world, essentially. So I had to show the Pope Mobile because every time I've ever seen it as I was a kid, it just kind of, one, I think it's funny that it's called the Pope Mobile. And then I just think it's interesting that a religious figure like this has something called a Pope Mobile. And then also just, it's like custom for him, right? And so you even see the papal crest there or whatever it's called. Right there on the side, his coat of arms or what have you, which I have a much better image of that later on in this presentation because it's very relevant to the conversation. So wherever the Pope goes, everyone is going to be looking towards the Pope. It's not unlike Islam. In Islam, no matter where you're at in the world, you pray towards Mecca 5 times a day. That's the whole entire thing, right? And then even when you go to Mecca for a pilgrimage, you're going to revolve around the Kaaba cube, right? 7 times. And then people are going to pray around it, but always looking towards the center, always looking towards the cube. And so this is what he represents, a living embodiment of a pilgrimage site in some ways, a living embodiment of this vertical axis, basically. So verticality, right? It implies this bridge between heaven and earth. He is the ultimate or greatest bridge builder. There's this centrality as well. So it's the heart of a tradition. And this is really so important because what tradition is keeping that center preserved, keeping it intact, right? So tradition is about preservation of ideas, customs, symbols, things of that sort. And in the modern world, we're losing this more and more and more. That the modern mind, especially the Western mind, although it's changing everywhere, I would say, has more of this idea of what's new is good, what's new is interesting, what's new is worthwhile, right? Versus preserving this old thing. And so every tradition has a core to it. Every tradition has sort of a symbolic center, basically. And the axis represents this center. And a lot of these ideas, by the way, of tradition relates to stability, right? It's maintaining order, just like what I have right here. And these concepts very strongly relate to Taurus as well. And Taurus is a fixed sign. And so there is this stability sort of intact just with Taurus symbolism. And so I think that that's also interesting that the Pope card, Hierophant card relates to Taurus. And earth comes into play with this stabilizing sort of force, or this stabilizing sort of factor. For all these reasons and more, the Pope represents this vertical axis, and with it comes this central sort of dynamic and this stable sort of concept. And as I've been saying, orientation, right? It gives you a point of pivot and direction. And so this is no different, by the way, than just having an authority figure, a leader, if you will, in the family. If it's your father, then the father is supposed to give you a point of pivot, a sense of direction. He's supposed to bring stability. So he operates symbolically as this central axis as well, right? And so the mother also has a lot of this symbolism completely tied to it as well, giving the family a point of pivot and a sense of direction. In actuality, we all are walking axis points. We all are walking poles, which is why we're called people, right? And so I've talked about this in other presentations, but we are all essentially sort of walking poles. But what I see today is that a lot of people symbolically are lost, and they don't have orientation, and they don't have a point of pivot, and they don't have direction, right? And so you can get your own point of pivot and direction by going within and by accessing your center. So this is how I approach things, at least. Going to your holy of holies. You don't necessarily need an external figure, right, to find orientation or direction. You just go within. The answer is actually much closer than you realize. All right, so let's take a look at some alternative names for the Hierophant, aka Pope card. And some of these are hermetic titles, but I think that they will basically be interesting to you guys. So we have Magus of eternal gods, right? Magus, a magician, right? They're connecting the Pope or the Hierophant with magic. And the eternal gods, so the oldest of gods, the most stable of gods, the most transcendental of gods, the most primordial of gods, right? One of the things I've learned over the years is that there really is a hierarchy of gods. And a lot of what people refer to as gods in today's world are much newer gods. They're almost like infants or like children or toddlers or something like that. But there are older tiers of deities. So Magus of eternal gods, that's super interesting. I think of primordial wisdom and primordial traditions and things of that sort. So the Pope is also known as the expounder of sacred mysteries, right? So let's not forget that Taurus also corresponds with the neck on the human body. That's one of the correspondences. And sometimes what you'll see is that the Hierophant or Pope actually has his neck covered, right? And so there's this whole thing with communication here, right? This idea of communication, communicating with his people, communicating with the masses, but then also who is the Pope or the Hierophant communicating with? Is it these eternal gods? I think there's something to be said about that. And then also just the idea that your words are magical, right? And that your words can transform things, that your words have power, your words have meaning. And when you're in a position like the Pope, obviously what you say matters quite a bit to a lot of people. And so he is privy to things as well that I'll say that he is not allowed to show and not allowed to share with people. And so that's the whole entire idea behind tradition as well, is that generally with traditions, there is an inner sanctum, and that this inner sanctum is held in high regard, and it is viewed as being very precious, and it's viewed as being something that's worth keeping a secret. It's not necessarily meant for everybody. The inner sanctum of all groups, really, it's not something that should be put out for the masses and just be blasted out there. And in fact, you can't find and penetrate the inner sanctum of a lot of groups, right? And so today we have a very different idea in the modern world. We think everything should be out in the open. We think everything should be just kind of on full display, right? But there's this idea that secrets were actually viewed as being sacred, essentially, and that what was sacred was kept secret. And now I think we kind of have things flipped, where what people tend to do is their profane actions are what they keep secret from their family, from lovers, from the community, whatever. So it's a completely sort of flip dynamic. So I'll just say, over the last handful of years, I've really grown to appreciate secrecy and everything it sort of represents, and how this is a necessary sort of thing. And so the Pope symbolically represents a keeper of these secrets. This relates, though, to an idea of what conceals also reveals. It's almost like a veil, right? And so the Pope is one who shows sacred things as well. And I think this last one is particularly juicy. One alternative name for the Hierophant card is one who teaches the rites of sacrifice and worship. So the bull was turned into a sacrificial animal, just like the Mithraic mysteries and other secret societies and whatnot. And the fact that the Pope died when he died, and maybe I'll just give this quick sort of qualifier here. I'm inclined to think that someone of that stature and prominence, when they pass, I think that sometimes the announcement is delayed. I think sometimes, I'm not saying in this case necessarily, they didn't necessarily pass, but actually there's a ritualistic angle. And so maybe now that person can go into hiding, something along these lines. So I'm not here to unpack that necessarily, but I'm just saying that that is always something with someone that's as popular as the Pope. I don't necessarily take their death date and the official narrative as exactly what happened. Because in this instance, there are so many synchronicities, there are so many layers of information that's encoded with it. It kind of boggles the mind, actually. And so him dying at the beginning of Taurus season, and then also the fact that Taurus is on the opposing end, on the ecliptic of Scorpio, which symbolically corresponds with death, I think is pretty interesting as well. So one who teaches the rites of sacrifice and worship. Very, very intriguing. I'm sure people in the comments and elsewhere have different opinions about what is going on here, and maybe sort of the political angles and kind of, what's happening at the Vatican in terms of if this was something that was more ritualistic in nature, if it all just happened and it was a divine sort of coincidence, or if there's maybe some sort of orchestration going on here. That's up to you guys to decide. And I feel like I'm still sort of unpacking all of it. So the letter V, we're talking about the fifth card of the major arcana, Roman numeral V, right? And there is a mega epic symbolic weave with the V and 5 as it relates to Taurus that I have to talk about. I wouldn't be doing any of this information justice if I didn't talk about it. And so we have to go there just briefly. So if you're unaware, Venus over the course of 8 years makes a 5-petaled flower, sometimes referred to as the Venus rose or the Venus pentagram. That's one thing. Venus rules Taurus, and from the perspective of Earth, this is the pattern it makes. Isn't that amazing? And so the pentagram is really, really loaded, and there's a lot of good reasons why people use it in magical sort of contexts and things like that. So when you see a pentagram, a lot of the times, I'm not saying exclusively, but a lot of the times it's a direct reference to Venus itself because of this patterning here. There's no other star, there's no other planet that makes this sort of pattern. It's also called the kiss of Venus as well. So here we go. Isn't that beautiful, right? So when you're dealing with stars, the amount of tips the star has and the sacred geometry of the star is completely related to the number of those tips, right? And so if we're talking about the 5-pointed star, it's inseparable from the number 5. So the number 5, even in my mind, when I think about things symbolically, when I think of the 5, I do think of the pentagram, and I do think of this shape. When I think of the 4, as an example, I think of the cross. I think of the X. I also think of the square because they're intrinsically related. So if you want to learn more about the number 4, study the square, study the cross, right? You're going to learn all sorts of stuff. So if you want to learn about the number 5, study the Venus rose, study the pentagram or pentacle, because they're intrinsically tied to each other. So this is very interesting because when we're dealing with the 5, we're also dealing with the 5th element as well, right? And so we're dealing with ether or spirit. And so to me, that is absolutely worth talking about, given the nature of what the Pope represents and what we're dealing with here. It's also really interesting, too. Clearly, a 5-pointed star is also related to the pentagon. You can see that you can put an inverted pentagram right there in that central pentagon. And this is the dodecahedron. And so this is the platonic solid that actually relates to spirit or ether as well, right? To me, this is all just kind of laying sort of the groundwork of what I'm trying to get to with the 5-pointed star. And essentially, my conclusion with it is that it represents the bridge between the etheric plane and the physical domain. In and of itself, the pentagram or pentacle represents a symbolic connection to the other side, right? And so let's get into it a little bit more. So this is a standard 5-pointed star, but when you start decoding the sacred geometry of it, the proportions really bring a lot of things to light. So I want to highlight the proportion right here between that first line and then that shorter second line there. The ratio here is 1.618 to 1. And this ratio can be found all over the natural world, right? And so even the human body, like our digits, our bones, and things like that, they unfurl or unfold in the manner that they do because of these proportions. And so these proportions are absolutely divine. You can see here that it's related to the golden spiral as an example. And so the square on the left, the larger square, and the smaller square on the upper right, it retains the exact same proportions that I'm referring to. And actually, I have calipers, just like what I showed you here, that has this measurement. And so having a pair of calipers like that, that retains the proportion. And if you start measuring things, you'll start seeing that this is a divine ratio, 1.618 to 1. And this is why the golden spiral does what it does. And so isn't the spiral in and of itself too, it kind of reminds me of a bridge. It kind of reminds me of a gateway of sorts. It connects perhaps the mundane and the profane, or it connects the physical with the spiritual. That's what the 5 and the pentacle represents in my view, based on everything that I've sort of looked into with it. And you can see, because of these proportions, how harmonious the pentacle actually is, from having a large 5-pointed star, and you can have nested stars within it, and then also to having this sort of chain, right, that just tapers down perfectly and really goes on forever and ever, right? There's no other star that works this way. So in some ways too, it appears as though the pentacle and its sacred geometry connects all that is above with all that is below. That's what this little diagram reminds me of. And also the macro, and then also the micro as well, right? So we're dealing with the 5. We're dealing with Roman numeral 5, which is a V. We're dealing with Venus, which starts with a V. And wouldn't you know it, you look in the heavens, you look at Taurus, and the most prominent feature of Taurus, if you've never looked, is a large V. In fact, when you're looking with your naked eye, this is a representation, this is a graphic, right? Not the actual stars themselves. But when you're looking into the heavens at Taurus, the V is the most prominent thing that really sticks out. It's the head and horns of the bull. And there's a large star, Aldebaran, right in there too. And so that's a royal star. That's the royal star of Taurus. So to me, the odds of all of these V connections are really, really mind blowing. So that's another huge, huge epic weave with everything, is that Taurus looks like a gigantic V in the sky. And there's just an illustration of Taurus. You can see they've really highlighted that eye there. This is the eye of the bull. There's a lot of symbolism attached to Aldebaran. That's a huge, huge sort of thing to get into as well. But I just want to mention this V connection with literally the Taurus constellation itself. And even what I see with the V, by the way, is I see duality coming from the monad, or I see that the singular divides itself into two, and that the two sort of points either descend into one, or more than likely, they're expressed from the one. It's the one shooting off into two different sort of expressions now. And so there's this sort of hierarchy there with the one and the two. And I see that the Hierophant or the Pope represents sort of a higher order as well. That's what he's symbolically supposed to convey, at least. All right. So there's so much that I want to talk about with this. The bull in the zodiac, Taurus. And I would just say, I'm just going to say it. I'm inclined to think all of the signs of astrology actually have a common origin story, and it's in the northern sky. And I'm getting ready to do a presentation on this because it is absolutely massive. It's so important, and it's what kind of gets me off. I think that I'm uniquely suited to talk about this. And for whatever reason, I found this weave, or rather, this weave really found me, right? So I'm basically prepping a presentation that says that all of the signs of astrology have a northern sky origin story. And this is because in primordial times, people were more so fixated and focused on the northern sky, and they were more so interested in the fixed stars as well. And so the fixed stars all go around one central star, which would be the North Star or Polaris, right? And Ursa Major and Ursa Minor circumambulate the pole star very, very closely. And that was the primordial sky clock. So there was a time before solar worship, and there was a time before people were really fixated on the ecliptic. And so let's take a look at the northern sky through the lens of the Dendera zodiac, and let's unpack the Taurus bull symbolism in the northern sky. If we zoom into the central sort of spot here of the Dendera zodiac, this central sort of disc, if we look towards the middle of it, we're going to see a few interesting things here. And the main thing, though, that I want to highlight is that leg. Do you see that leg of the bull right there? So this was Ursa Major. And so with the Dendera zodiac, you're looking at really an approximation of things, right? It's not supposed to be a dead sort of one-to-one representation of the heavens, but it's almost kind of a exaggerated look at what's going on up there. But this was the thigh of the bull. This was Ursa Major going around the pole star. This constellation, this thigh of the bull, had 7 stars, right? This constellation, I'm inclined to think also, is where the original 7 stars of enlightenment came from. And over time, the symbolism of those 7 stars actually shifted over to the 7 wandering stars, which would be the 7 traditional planets, basically. People were more so focused on the northern sky, and Ursa Major and Minor made up the primordial sky clock before people started looking towards the ecliptic and became more solar, right? And this is so lost on most modern people. And I really do understand why, but I feel like it's part of my calling to, at the very least, dive into this material and then, of course, share what I can here. And so this thigh of the bull represents Ursa Major, and there were different rituals. One in particular, it was called the opening of the mouth ritual, the opening of the mouth ceremony. And I've been talking about this for years, but there are some reliefs that you can see where a person is presenting the thigh of a bull to a pharaoh. And sometimes even that bull's thigh is almost at the tip of the mouth of the pharaoh. The opening of the mouth ritual, right? This ritual relates to going to the underworld. It relates to going to the other side, right? So that's one thing that I think is really interesting. And what's also very interesting is that there's a woman named Judy K. King, and she has a book called The Isis Thesis. And she came out with this book, and what she says is based on her decoding of the hieroglyphs that essentially the at least in one point in time in ancient Egypt, people saw that when they died, that their soul ascended to the northern sky. And this is traditionally what I've learned, what a lot of cultures actually believed, is that they believed that there was a gateway to heaven and that, or a stairway to heaven, and that this stairway or gateway actually went towards the northern sky, went towards Polaris, went towards the center of this wheel of heaven, basically, along the lines of what we refer to as, the axis mundi, or the world axis. And she says that there was a belief that people went to the northern sky and exited the cusp of the horn of a bull, basically. And so there is a northern correspondence with the bull's horn as well. So not only was there a bull's thigh there was a symbolic horn or symbolic opening in the northern sky that your body, your soul or spirit would ascend out of, right? So this is all very interesting, obviously, as it relates to the Pope and Taurus and everything else. But what I'm trying to say here is that there was a major shift from Ursa Major being the 7 stars of enlightenment, Ursa Major being related to the bull, and this was during primordial times. And what happened is that basically people became more solar over time. And the way I personally perceive it is that there is a direct correspondence with people becoming more solar over time and this sort of fall from grace that humanity has had. Sort of this lack of spiritual sort of awareness and things like that. And so you could say that we live in a dark age right now. And there's all sorts of opinions on, are we at the end of this dark age? Have we transitioned out of it and things are getting better? What's sort of going on here? And the main thing that I just want to highlight is that what I've read is this current dark age we live in is because people have lost their center, and therefore they no longer revere anything in the external world that sort of relates to the center in a truly sort of like holistic kind of way, right? And so it's one thing to maybe go to a pilgrimage location and acknowledge this vertical axis that this site has been sort of related to. But are you changing your lifestyle? Are you spiritually aligned, right? Are you living a holistic life? How do you treat people? How do you treat yourself? What does your inner landscape actually look like? And so I'm inclined to think that during primordial times, which some people refer to this as the primordial tradition, by the way, if you want to do more research, during primordial times, people had this reverence for the northern sky. All of their symbolism seemingly was kind of very much condensed in the northern sky. And then there was a migration away from the northern sky to the path of the sun. And so what happened was the symbolism attached to Ursa Major, the thigh of the bull, shifted over to Taurus. And within Taurus, you have the Pleiades, right? And so notice even the similarity between the way Ursa Major looks and the Pleiades. They both kind of look like dippers. They both look like vessels. And so I haven't said this yet, but Ursa Major is the Big Dipper. And so to me, that's a mind-blowing realization, because I remember looking at the Big Dipper a lot as a kid, and I had no idea that there was all of this esoteric, hidden, mind-blowing information associated with it, right? And so there are a number of authors that have written about this, by the way. So this is not my own personal conclusion. Hey, Mario is the first person to talk about this shift. No, there are people who really, truly understand this. And so that adds validity, a lot of validity, because there's actually more authors than you would realize that have talked about this. And I have a number of those books in my library. And so the best way to explain this would be to say that we went from a polar dynamic to a solar dynamic. There's a great shift from polar symbolism to solar symbolism, and that completely changed the game. In fact, I would say that this shift could be referred to as a pole shift as well. That's kind of how I personally perceive it. But with this shift also came the shifting perspective of mankind, of what they consider to be sort of God in the heavens, or actually what they consider to be the true axis in the heavens. Beforehand, it was the stationary pole star. Nowadays, I would say that a lot of people have taken that same symbolism and they put it right towards the sun. And the sun symbolically also relates to a pole. So the pole shifted from this vertical sort of dynamic to a more so horizontal dynamic with the sun. And I think that with this shift, a lot of things kind of got thrown off, right? For better or worse, actually. I'm still very optimistic. I'm glad to be living in this timeline and everything else. So even though I say it threw things off, I'm also kind of detached from that as well in some ways. It is probably just a necessary sort of thing. So another way of talking about this would be that there was a shift from the center to the circumference, right? From center to circumference. And so basically a shift from the center of the wheel to the wheel itself. The middle of the wheel is the most transcendental part of the wheel. It's the most balanced part of the wheel. That's what the pole star represents. The external part of the wheel, the outside of the wheel, is the least balanced part of the wheel, right? It's the most chaotic. It's always turning. It's always moving. It kind of reminds me of the sun, right? If the sun is the new central axis for a lot of people, it's always constantly, rising and then falling, right? Rising and then setting. The pole star is the same every single night, night after night. It never moves. In fact, it's still there even when you can't see it because it's daylight, right? So you will find that there's a thread of bull symbolism in the north shifting over to this new sort of location because people needed, I would say, a mirror for this original symbolism, but it needed to be along the lines of the ecliptic. It needed to be along the path of the ecliptic. And Taurus and the Pleiades served as a perfect substitute, basically, right? So I would say in more primordial times, the central axis was the vertical axis. It was the transcendental sort of spiritual pole that everything revolved around. And no matter what your cosmology looks like, of what kind of Earth we live on, there is absolutely a Taurus field around Earth, no matter what you think it looks like. And so I'll leave that up to your imagination because I know there's a lot of debate and a lot of different opinions about that. But notice that the center of the Taurus field has an opening, right? There is a electromagnetic grid around Earth called the magnetosphere, and it's toroidal in nature. And my understanding is the opening of the Taurus field of this magnetic grid is why we actually have the northern lights, the aurora borealis, right? And kind of a mind blower, let's not forget, this is called a what? A Taurus field. What are the odds that this is referred to as a Taurus field of all things? The spelling is different, but phonetically it's exactly the same. A Taurus field. That's not a mistake. That's not an accident by any stretch of the imagination. And if you really want my opinion, I'm inclined to think that we live in a nested toroidal structure. So if you imagine Taurus fields within Taurus fields, they all still connect through their center, basically. It's the same unifying center. And if I haven't expressed this yet in today's presentation, I'm inclined to think that there are realms above and realms below, and they're all connected through their center. That's the whole entire thing. They're all connected through their center. You can even imagine these realms above and below as being very much related to a wheel, right? And this is no different than our chakra system. So with our chakras, we have 7 chakras traditionally. I know there's opinions about that, right? But chakra means disc or wheel. And guess what? There's a symbolic bridge or symbolic pole that connects all of them together, which would be your spine, right? And so this is sort of how it works, in my opinion. All centers in actuality are connected with each other. And it's the center itself that is what my metaphysics now completely hinges on. It needs to hinge on it. There's like no other way sort of around it. That's kind of been my conclusion with everything. And so I would say that sort of the metaphysical framework of primordial northern polar peoples, which we all descend from that, no matter who you are, no matter what you look like. I've explained this in other live streams and presentations and things. Everything hinged around this center within, the center of the home, the center of your village, and the center of your region, and also the center of the heavens, which the best representation of that would be the North Star. And very, very interesting as well, in ancient Egypt, this was the symbol for the opening to the other side. So if we're to exit this horn of this great bull, and there is a sort of door there, or there's an opening of some sort, this would be the gateway to the other side. And they use the 5-pointed star of all of the designs, of all of the shapes, of all of the icons or imagery. It's the 5-pointed star that represented the opening to the duat, right? So that's not a coincidence. And so once again, the Pope relates to the number 5 and the pentacle, right? Being the 5th card of the major arcana, the Hierophant. And also this opening to the other side, the true sort of bridge between this domain and the afterlife. So when people became more solar and this shift happened, this great symbolic shift from polar to solar, this became the new axis, this blurry sort of line that you see there, right? And the new axis went from Taurus to Scorpio, basically, right? Because it needed to involve the ecliptic. It needed to involve the path of the sun. So now what a lot of people in today's world, they have sort of a fondness for the Pleiades. And I've heard many people say sort of variations on this theme, that they are a Pleiadian star seed or something, or that their ancestors came from the Pleiades. They were visited by Pleiadians, something along these lines. And I did a presentation, which I believe it's this slide right here, called The Pleiadians, where I really decode all of this stuff. And I really sort of explain this great shift from polar to solar. And I explain that the Pleiades basically is sort of a secondary sort of storyline, and that there is an original storyline associated with a lot of Pleiadian symbolism. And it actually has to do with the northern sky, right? And so this axis between Taurus and Scorpio really is super fascinating. And this is kind of how it breaks down. So the Taurus sort of gateway is sometimes referred to as the silver gate. You maybe have heard me talk about that at some point. The Scorpio gateway is sometimes referred to as the golden gate. The interesting thing is that when you're looking towards Scorpio, you're looking towards the galactic center. And when you're looking towards Taurus, you're looking towards the galactic anticenter. And so you're looking away from the center of the galaxy, right? And I have more opinions about the true center of the galaxy, but let's just say that this is the case. That's very interesting. So you're looking towards Scorpio. This would be the heavenly domain, the heavenly sort of gateway or opening, the golden gate. And then when you're looking towards Taurus, this would be sort of the hellish sort of gateway, right? And both of these constellations have massive royal stars associated with them. Aldebaran, as I've already mentioned, in Taurus, and then Antares with Scorpio. And so I see this as being the new axis during solar times. This was not the axis that people refer to in primordial polar times, in my opinion. Once again, check out this presentation if you haven't seen it. I actually, to be honest with you, I think this is one of my best ones that I've ever done. All right, so getting back to the Hierophant card, aka the Pope card, the Hebrew letter that associates with this card is Vav, which means nail, right? And for a little while, it kind of eluded me. Why would this card be associated with nail? And over time, I realized what the deal is, basically. So it looks like a nail, even if you're unfamiliar with what a rusty nail looks like. That's what it looks like. if it's been a while. But it really comes together when you consider that the nail is also related to the pole star. In fact, it was once referred to as the nail star. And this makes all of the sense in the world, right? Because it's the point of pivot in the heavens. And so you can see Polaris there, again, related to pole symbolism, Polaris, which has an innate relationship with the North Pole. The fact that it's called the nail star really, really resonates with me because, again, all of the fixed stars go around the nail star, right? It could have been called the pin star. It has a bunch of names, actually, a lot of alternative names, but it's almost like a pinwheel, right? So it's the pin that allows the wheel to turn. It's the axle of a wheel that allows the wheel to turn. That's the symbolism that's been associated with the pole star. So nail, as it relates to the pole star, to me is like a dead ringer sort of association. Also, let's not forget that the nail binds, right? And so the nail binds pieces of wood together. And in many ways, I see the symbolism relating to ether. Symbolically, ether is what binds this reality together as well. And it reminds me just of the symbolism of a bridge, right? This bridge binding or allowing access to these different realms, right? Above and below. And so that's what the nail represents, in my opinion, in this context. But there's more going on here. Kind of relating the nail to an axis. That's what it represents. My sort of go-to authors say the same thing. You know, so many symbols go back to this transcendental pillar that we refer to as the world axis. The staff, the nail, our spine, the wand, right? The caduceus. There's so many examples. And so I want to show you one of my favorite illustrations that kind of represents a lot of the things I like to talk about. And so this is a representation of Jacob's ladder. The ladder is not unlike a bridge, right? And you'll see here that there is a central pillar. Once again, the Pope represents the central pillar. He sits between the two pillars. He's throned between the two pillars. And it's this central pillar that's truly transcendental, right? You can see that the heavens break for this pillar. And what do you see around the top of the pillar? You see 7 stars. This is Ursa Major, in my opinion, right? And so some people, I think, who are unaware of the polar tradition would probably associate it with the Pleiades. Might even say maybe it's symbolic of the 7 wandering stars, right? One of the things to note, though, regarding the Pleiades, I showed a slide of it earlier, but there's actually only 6 main stars in the Pleiades. And there's 6 main stars that have always been sort of illustrated, but we refer to it often as the 7 sisters. There is a myth about the missing 7th sister because it's encoding the shift from polar to solar, basically. I talk about that in that presentation. So the Pleiades really more accurately has 6 stars, right? And so they had to sort of come up with the mythological reason why there's a missing 7th star. That wouldn't be necessary unless there was this huge shift, right? But you see the 7 stars of Ursa Major closely around the center of the sky. You see these angels coming down that ladder. And then you also see, too, down below, Jacob literally has like a wand or a stick with him. Very, very polar in nature, right? But you have these 2 side pillars. Again, this is more dualistic. The central pillar is more unifying. It's more holistic. It sort of precedes and came before these 2 other pillars, right? And so what I like to say is that polarity preceded duality. And the central pole represents that polarity. And then these 2 side pillars represent duality more so, right? And so you can see, though, all of the symbolism that I'm getting into today really sort of conveyed here in just this one illustration. And there's, of course, more to talk about and decode, but let's move on. So the nail symbolically represents this central pillar as well, just a really, really small version of it. And I think it's so interesting that Pope Francis was a Jesuit, the first Jesuit pope. And when you look at the symbol for the Jesuits, they encode nail symbolism of all things, right? So once again, the Hierophant card corresponds with the Hebrew letter Vav, which means nail. And there's all of these nail connotations that I'm bringing up. And then here, the first Jesuit pope, literally their emblem is related to nails. And so the three lower nails, my understanding is that they represent the two nails that were nailed into Christ while he was on the cross with his hands, and then also that third nail at his feet. So there we go. So when we're dealing with the central axis, or this symbolic nail that exists and is driven through different layers of reality, right? We're just talking about the simple pillar, right? And when you look at the Kabbalistic tree of life, you'll see that there are, of course, these three pillars that I've been talking about, but it's the central pillar that extends above and below the two other side pillars. And in fact, there's a hidden Sephiroth on this central pillar called Doth, and Doth gives you access to the Klipothic tree, which is basically the inverted tree, right? And so the Night Side of Eden by Kenneth Grant is one of the go-to works, classic works, I think, modern classics about this whole entire dynamic. And he openly says that Doth corresponds with the North, right? And so the North has always been related to this transcendental sort of quality. But it's really interesting because there are different realms to this tree of life sort of dynamic, right? And so there's 4 different realms. And you can see I have 3 lines here dividing these realms. And in my opinion as well, it seems as though there's another way of breaking it down, and it's through the horizontal paths, right? And so there's 22 paths to the Kabbalistic tree of life. There's 22 Hebrew letters. There's 22 cards of the major arcana. There's 22 paths. And so the central pillar goes through 3 horizontal paths, right? You see that there? Well, I think it's really interesting because it kind of reminds me of the Papal Cross. And so the Papal Cross reminds me very much of the central pillar. And really, I mean, to me, it's like very clear that any sort of cross or wand, the vertical axis represents that Z axis that I've been talking about, right? And so here you can see these 3 different layers of reality. And to me, this kind of relates as well to the idea of a leader or a lord or an emperor actually having sort of 3, at the very least, sort of emanations or expressions, right? 3 states of being. And so to me, that's what this cross also represents, is this verticality that unifies these 3 different states of being. If you want to learn more about that, The King of the World or Lord of the World by Rene Guénon really gets into it. The Symbolism of the Cross is also worth reading by him. And then also he has a book called The Great Triad, where he gets into some of this symbolism as well. The fact that this unifying presence, this sort of leader or central axis figure, unifying these different realms above and below. So I think that that is one of sort of the secrets going on here. But it's no different than the nail, right? It's no different than the nail almost binding several pieces of wood together, right? That's at least how I see it. I mentioned it earlier, but it also kind of looks like a ladder. That's what some people have interpreted. It's almost like Jacob's ladder, right? Going to the great beyond. But when you look into cross symbolism, you know, one of the things that is worth discussing is the fact that what really predates the cross is the standing stone. And I have a great book here about the symbolism of the cross, and the author's name escapes me right now, but he opens up the whole entire book by saying as much, and by literally showing you standing stones and saying that the vertical standing stone predates the cross, and that before there was a horizontal arm, let alone 3 horizontal arms on the cross, what existed was just the simple vertical axis, which to me, this makes all of the sense in the world. It's more primordial, it's simpler, and it just stands the test of time, right? It's so basic. So I thought that was worth bringing up. including the fact that in order for this to be sort of a central totem, a world axis symbol, it doesn't even need to be pillar-like, although this does look like a pillar. It looks like an obelisk or a column, right? Even a simple stone will do it. And so there's a great book called At the Center of the World by John Michel. And he really gets into all of these central standing stones in Europe and sort of around the world. And he really decodes and explains sort of, what they meant symbolically. And oftentimes, what people would do is they would locate the center of their region, and this science is called centrography. People would put a central stone there, or they would put a temple there, or they would put a tree there, right? That would be their symbolic world tree. But this would be the middle of their sort of empire or region. And this is where people would congregate. And this was their vertical axis, right? This was their pilgrimage location. This is what they saw as binding all that is above with all that is below. But it could be just a simple stone as well. And sometimes these stones were referred to as dividing stones or the stone of proportions. There's different names for it, but the idea behind that is that it divided the empire. So from that central stone, oftentimes there would be lines that emanate from it like a cross. So then from the middle of that stone, you have north, south, east, and west as an example. So now you have the land being quartered. And so this central stone was a dividing stone because it divided the land evenly from the center. And the whole idea behind leadership and kingship and things like that is that they wanted to rule from the center. That was the whole entire idea. And I've talked about this in other presentations, but it was really important for them to rule from the center of their region because they wanted to embody the axis. So if you were going to embody the central axis, well, it would make sense that you rule from the center. It would make sense that your throne symbolically, or where you lived or where your temple was in the middle of your region, right? But it's really fascinating because stone symbolism really completely relates to what it means to be a pope, right? Everything that I said earlier about stability, right? This point of pivot, orientation, that's what the stone represents. The stone symbolism is freaking massive, and it's so ancient and primordial and interesting that literally I could do a stone presentation and we can go on forever. But let's quote Barbara Walker here, and she gets into stone symbolism in her entry on the Hierophant card. She says, deeper investigation of the Roman legend of Peter finds the curious tradition of a Peter, Petra, or Pater, acting as a keeper of the keys of the afterworld well before the Christian era. I'm just going to read this one more time. Deeper investigation of the Roman legend of Peter finds the curious tradition of a Peter, Petra, or Pater, acting as a keeper of the keys of the afterworld well before the Christian era. She goes on to say, the etymological relationship of the words for father and rock, Petra, had a common source in the phallic pillar of stone planted in the Vatican Mount, where Christian mythology later located the upside-down cross of Saint Peter. So I'm just going to read this one more time, if you don't mind. The etymological relationship of the words for father and rock, Petra, had a common source in the phallic pillar of stone, not unlike that standing stone, planted in the Vatican Mount, where Christian mythology later located the upside-down cross of St. Peter. We're talking about St. Peter's Square. There were other manifestations of this rock of ages. Egyptians knew an obelisk spirit called Petra, perhaps the same rock pillar worshipped by the Edomites at the holy city of Petra. In the Bible, this deity was the rock that begat thee. Whoa. So she's saying a lot with all of this. But just to break it down briefly, there is an etymological relationship with the word Petra, Pater, as in like Jupiter. And that's actually, there's a huge correspondence with the Hierophant card and Jupiter. In fact, in some decks that I have, they make that relationship way more explicit. Also, the word papa, father, and pope, right? So the stone, the pope symbolically represents this stabilizing force, and stone symbolism completely relates to all of this stuff. And so she mentioned this obelisk, right, in St. Peter's Square. So let's take a look at this obelisk. This obelisk literally came from Egypt, right? It came from Heliopolis. And my understanding is that the original name for Heliopolis translated to the city of pillars, right? Fascinating. Here's another image here, right? And so you see that obelisk, that Egyptian obelisk, this Egyptian stone, right? In the middle of St. Peter's Square. Well, I find this interesting because another axis symbol, unbeknownst to most people, is the key itself, right? As I said earlier, there's so many world axis symbols, but the key also represents the world axis. It's deep, deep encoded symbolism says as much, right? And so the key is nothing without a lock, right? And so keys and locks. I used to say this all the time, but poles and holes. So much symbolism breaks down to poles and holes. And this is what, sexual symbolism really just boils down to in some ways, traditionally, right? Poles and holes, the phallus and the yoni. And so the keeper of the keys, right? The key itself is a world axis symbol, and it loosens and it also binds. That's what the key represents. It'll bind something because it's implied that the lock basically needs the key to open it, but it also needs the key to close it, right? And so he's the keeper of the keys to the afterlife, between the gates of heaven and hell, regardless of where you think they might exist, where these openings actually might exist, right? So the obelisk actually, as a world axis symbol, shares a lot with the key itself. Well, I find this really intriguing as well, because when you look at St. Peter's Square, it looks like a keyhole, right? So can you guys see that pillar right there, the obelisk? It's right in the middle of a keyhole. And this is where the Pope will address his people, right? He is the keeper of keys. So just to show you just another way of looking at it, St. Peter's Square, you can see that there's the obelisk dead center in the middle of that circle. It looks a lot like a keyhole, in my opinion. And just to show you, if you don't know what a traditional keyhole looks like, there you go. I mean, is that not a dead ringer right there? That the symbolic obelisk from the city of pillars, which represents a stone, which has a relationship with where we even get the word father and papa from, aka Pope, has all of this sort of stuff going on with it. Like, it kind of boggles my mind a little bit, to be honest with you. And then also, too, if we look at the official emblem of the Pope, it is crossed keys, right? You have the golden key for the golden gate, you've got the silver key for the silver gate. And what unifies these keys? What's transcending these keys? It's the Pope himself, right? And so you have the papal tiara. Basically, this is really saying that he is that central axis, right? And I thought it was really fascinating looking into all of this stuff for this presentation. The fact that when there's a vacant spot for the Pope's position, this is the official emblem right here. And so it's the same crossed keys, but now you actually have this sort of umbrella, which to me, I mean, just look at the handle. That's another world axis pole symbol, right? So this is new to me. I want to look into it a little bit more. There's a few things I feel like I can kind of pull at with it, but I'm just going to let you guys see it for now, and we can move on here. So there you go. The Hierophant card oftentimes has crossed keys. It's really interesting too. There's some decks where one of the acolytes, one of the figures down below, is actually trying to grab one of these keys, right? So there's a lot of symbolism going on here with the keys, from him keeping secrets, him revealing, concealing, keeping things sacred, holy, protecting that inner sanctum, if you will. But he absolutely is this figure that keeps these keys. And, I just think that that obelisk right there is like a clear sort of representation of it on an esoteric level. Well, I think this is really intriguing as well. Where else do you see the Pope in the major arcana? You see him on the death card, right? So this is the 13th card of the major arcana. And here you can see a Pope-like figure with his fish cap on, right? And he looks like he is begging for mercy. And so this one kind of blew my mind as well while preparing for this presentation, because let's just zoom in a little bit. And you have the Pope, and he is right below these two towers, right? So even in this card, he's in between two pillars symbolically, right? And he is not the transcendental pillar in this case. In fact, death really is in some ways, right? That it looks like his authority is being sort of usurped by death himself, right? That even the keeper of the keys, the person with all of this sacred knowledge, this axial priest king sort of figure, he even has to succumb to the cycles and rhythms of death, who comes on a white horse, who also has a flag that is showing a two-door rose that is five-petaled, essentially making an inverted pentagram, right? And so it's kind of interesting that that's sort of the thing as well, is that we're seeing this pentacle on the flag itself. And the Pope there's nothing he can really do in this circumstance or in this instance. Also, what's pretty mind-blowing about it as well is that Taurus has this relationship with Scorpio. And the death card is ruled by what? Scorpio. So we're talking more about the Taurus Scorpio axis here, right? And so we're talking about this gateway sort of dynamic, right? Which shifted from polar times to solar times. And so now when I see this card and I acknowledge this priest Pope figure as the Hierophant, and then death clearly relates to Scorpio, this card really is about this new axis that I'm referring to, this solar axis between Taurus, the Pleiades, Aldebaran, and then also Scorpio, Antares, the galactic center, right? And so I think that that's really on display here now. I've never seen it so clearly like that before. But you'll see too that death is holding that flag. That flag is, to me, an axial symbol. The pole is itself. Notice that death actually has a clear sort of pole or a clear line from the upper portion of the canvas to the lower portion of the canvas. And so that pole goes from the very top of the card, goes down. And I would say personally that the right leg of death and the left leg of the horse continue the line of that pole, right? So there's almost an implied vertical line from the top of the pole all the way down to that leg of the horse. And one-legged symbolism is axial symbolism like all day long. I'm very convinced of that now. Just like I was showing you with the thigh of the bull, it's just one leg. But one-legged symbolism, it basically is just the axis, pretty much. And so the real holder of the axis here is death, not the Pope, right? So hopefully you guys can appreciate all of that. All right. So the last thing that I'll just say here is that I think it's interesting that some people esoterically have referred to the infinity sign as a run and return. It's a run and return between this domain and the afterlife or the underworld, right? That symbolically, in some ways, we're just kind of going back and forth, pinging, the spiritual and the divine, the heavenly and the terrestrial. And that in some ways, it's just this run and return from this place to that place, back and forth. In some ways, it kind of reminds me actually of the Taurus field as well, inner to outer, right? This looping sort of dynamic, right? That just perpetually goes on and on and on. And I think this is worth bringing up because it also looks like the number 8, right? And so Scorpio is the 8th sign of the zodiac, and symbolically has a major correspondence with sex and death as well. And let's not forget that Pope Francis died at 88 years of age. So you have the double 8, double infinity. So just a quick take on that. It's not even really like the whole point behind this presentation, but I just had to include that because I thought the synchronicity between Scorpio, 8, 88, I don't know, kind of intriguing, right? But that's going to do it, guys. Thank you so much for hanging out and being here live or catching it after the fact. A few announcements. So I have a new podcast. It's the Symbolic Studies podcast, and I just released an episode on Taurus symbolism. And I just have to say it's a really good one. And I think it's the best one we've put out. So if you're interested in checking that out, you have to be a subscriber on Patreon or my website right now, at least. But it will be released publicly later on. But you should subscribe to the podcast regardless on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, what have you. So give that a go. So for Patreon, patreon.com/symbolic studies. If you liked this presentation, I've got like a dozen more that are completely exclusive just for members, right? So I'm going through the major arcana, and I have cards on everything from the Fool to the Hanged Man. Right now, I'm actually working on the Death card episode right now, which to me, it's just kind of blowing my mind too. That's what I'm actively working on right now is the Death card. And then all of this is kind of happening. So if you want access to that and early access to the podcast, patreon.com/symbolic studies. You can also go to my website, symbolicstudies.com/secrets. Subscription is just $5 a month, and it really, really goes a long way. So thank you to everyone who is currently a member. And also for sessions, I am available for tarot readings, birth chart readings, and also private lessons. So if you guys are interested in any of that, you can find more information on my site. I'm also available for art and design. So I've been a graphic designer for a good long while, I think 25 years now. And if you guys need branding services, if you guys need help with your packaging, social media, things like that, you can feel free and reach out. And I actually have a portfolio on my site. So if you go to symbolicstudies.com, you can see my portfolio. And design is actually how I got into symbolism. So if you want a designer who's more symbolically inclined, definitely hit me up. I also have Taurus prints. And so this is one of my favorite prints. And I don't know how many I have left, but these were silk screened by hand. One of my favorite designs. There's more information on my site. Definitely check that out if you're looking for a good gift for a Taurus person in your life. And for everything else, you can visit symbolicstudies.com. So thank you guys so much. I really appreciate you being here. I'll be around with another presentation pretty soon, I'm sure. But until then, be well. Take care.